Hello, welcome back to our live coverage of the UN Climate Talks here in Cancun in Mexico. It's heading towards 1 in the morning and we're still picking up some analysis of the new negotiating texts and countries' responses to them. But we've been joined by Professor Hugh Montgomery of University College London. And Hugh, you're going to tell us a little bit about why you're here as an expert in health, because maybe it's not the first thing people think of when they think about climate change. Maybe they think of polar bears first. And also your impressions of these talks, because I believe that it's your first kind of big climate talks. Yeah. But let's start with the health. Why are you interested in climate change as a health issue?
I think you're right. It is thought of as an issue relating to tree frogs and polar bears, and that is important, and we're the top of an ecological pyramid. But in the end, it's humans that will suffer, and they'll suffer in horrific ways at a sort of biblical scale. So the first element is that whilst there's much talk of the fiscal impacts of this, what happens to the dollar, what happens to the pound, what happens to the yen, in the end the impact is going to be on people. There's a second issue though, in that even if one's a skeptic on these issues, and I appreciate that other people do have different views, one can park that issue separately and say what happens when one moves to a low carbon economy and lifestyle. And if you look at what happens when one moves to low carbon lifestyles, there are huge benefits to human health and massive financial benefits that come with it. So in fact, there are many reasons to move towards a low carbon economy, and one can in many ways even ignore the climate change issue if one wishes and just say actually going towards low carbon is very good for health and it's very good for economies. So two good reasons I think for moving that way.
And is that something that we're starting to see people accept, do you think? Are people realising that this isn't all about the kind of polar bears and tree frogs, and actually this is a human issue? And in your experience when you talk to people about this, are people kind of taking this in?
Yes, I think it is getting bite, but I think of course if we wind the clock back 10 years when people were first discussing this issue, people were saying, well, no one's going to really get a grasp for the impacts of climate change until they start seeing them for themselves. And of course, we are now seeing them for ourselves. So whilst of course there have always been floods, there have always been droughts, there have always been fires, this increase in frequency we're seeing is entirely consistent with what we might expect. And this level of suffering at the moment, I think we've seen around the world with the floods in Pakistan and the fires in Israel and Russia, are tasters of what's to come, and people are getting a feel for that a bit more, I think, and are getting more engaged.
I want to ask you a little bit about your impressions of this conference, because a year ago I was in Copenhagen and that was my first conference of parties, and I think it was probably a very different impression to this. So what have you made of it here?
I guess I've got a mixed feeling about this meeting, and there are the bits that are elating and the bits that are depressing. The depressing part is just to the degree at which the basic science, which, let's face it, every government here accepts, I think without reservation, every major scientific body in the world accepts that climate change is real and that humans are causing it, and it poses a real threat and a major hazard with that risk. Knowing that science, and in many cases accepting some very specific science on gigatons of emissions that can come, somehow that gets parked to one side and other elements come in. And in fact, at one of the Indian delegation's talks last week, someone put it rather well, saying that actually you can't argue with the science. If someone tells you need 3 coronary grafts or you're going to die, you can't barter to say, well, actually, financially, I'd rather have 1, or it's someone else's fault, therefore I won't have any, because the result will be the same. The science is the science. So that's been the slightly depressing part of it. I think on the upside, there have been some agreements where we might not have expected them. The process exists when we might have thought it would have got killed off. And I think there is an increasing awareness of the issues of which we've just spoken, which is that this isn't just about the pound and the dollar. This is going to affect and is already affecting real lives. And that gives me some hope for the sense that some sort of urgency might get injected into this process. So I don't go away too despondent.
And how do you see this playing out over the coming years? Do you think that there's a movement here now which is kind of starting to identify the kind of effective ways to communicate climate change and the impacts it's going to have? Do you think people are going to start mobilising around this issue now?
I'm not altogether sure, actually. It's a very good question. I think it's easy to mobilise around something when times are easy, and at the moment times are hard. And I think that's why a lot of people have shifted, and understandably so. If your major concern suddenly becomes employment and income and schooling and so forth, and that becomes an overwhelming priority, I can see why other things would get left behind. That's entirely understandable and reasonable. I would hope, though, that there will be a permeation into the consciousness elsewhere that this is a real problem, because bear in mind, this is often portrayed as a slightly woolly, left-wing, tree-hugging, finger-knitting agenda, but it's a peculiar agenda if it lines up health with ecology, with a lot of big business, with every major scientific body in the world, with every major political body in the world and nearly all governments, with the military, with much of big business, including CEOs of major oil companies. That's a very peculiar alliance if this is some sort of weird conspiracy. And I only have to hope now that, in fact, that meshing leads towards some very positive action, because that's what we now need to see. We've had a lot of discussion, we've now got frameworks beginning to appear, but what we really need to see is the first ton of CO2 not being emitted, and we haven't got there yet.
Well, Hugh, maybe that call to action is a good note to leave it on, so I'll just say thank you very much for joining us, and let's keep our fingers crossed that these talks continue to go well throughout the course of the night.
Fingers crossed. Thanks very much.
Thank you.